We will go ahead and get started. We are recording, just to give everybody a heads up before we begin. So I will go ahead and get started. So thank you everybody for joining us today. My name is Althea Walker. I am the Tribal Climate Science Liaison for the American Indian Higher Education Consortium at the Southwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. And today our presentation is brought to you by Dr. Shasta Gon, and the title being Coping with Crisis, Building Psychosocial Resilience in the Face of Climate Change, and hosted by the Southwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. And before we get to Shasta's presentation, I just wanted to give you some background, especially for those who aren't familiar with the Southwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. We were established in 2011 to provide objective scientific information, tools, and techniques that land, water, wildlife, and cultural resource managers and other interested parties can apply to anticipate, monitor, and adapt to climate change impacts in the southwestern United States. We are a partnership of institutions across the Southwest. So University of Arizona is our host institution. We partner with the Scripps Institution of Oceanography at UC San Diego, the University of California, Los Angeles, University of California, Davis, the Desert Research Institute in Nevada, Utah State University in Utah. And we blur the lines a little bit and run into Colorado because of the Colorado River. So partner also with Colorado State University. And also another unique part of our partnerships and collaborations and our partnership with the American Indian Higher Education Consortium, aside from providing climate adaptation support across the 5 states, we also provide climate adaptation support to the tribes and tribal colleges and universities across the region. So I wanted to introduce you today to our presenter, Dr. Shasta Gon. She is the Environmental Director and the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Palo Banda Mission Indians. She has worked for PALA since January 2005 and established the PALA's Tribal Historic Preservation Office in 2008. She has also been an adjunct professor in the anthropology department at CSU San Marcos since 2006. She received her PhD in anthropology from the University of New Mexico in 2011. She is the chair of the National Association of TIPO officers, a member of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, secretary of the board for the Native American Environmental Protection Coalition, leader of the Tribal Working Group for the Climate Science Alliance South Coast, a member of ITEP's Climate Change Advisory Committee, Vice President of the Board for the Upper San Luis Rey Resource Conservation District, and she also oversees the Tribal Climate Health Project, in which this presentation is part of that. And just, you know, my personal connection to Shasta, professional connection to Shasta, I've had the privilege of being able to work with her, you know, not only as my tribal climate liaison position, but also my prior work with the Gila River Indian community. And I think the first time I met her, we sat on a panel together out in San Diego for the Tribal Climate Leader Summit. So it's been a pleasure of getting to know Shasta over the years, working with her. Certainly respect her work, her allyship, her friendship, sisterhood. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Shasta, and we will do Q&A after she's done with her presentation. And yes, so you have the reins, Shasta.
Thank you, Althea. And I will just share my screen here real quick. Here we go. So yeah, again, thank you so much for that that kind introduction. I think a lot of you have probably been through that sort of awkward sitting there while somebody reads your list of things and probably thinks, geez, maybe I could, you know, pare that down a little bit, you know, take some of that stuff out. But you know what? I'm actually going to go in the opposite direction and say thank you for including all of that. Women don't take enough credit for the work that they do. So I'm going to go ahead and be like, yeah, I'm a badass. So thank you for reading that out and including everything. We're all doing a ton of work. we're all working in climate change. We're working in, potentially like me, also in cultural resource advocacy and preservation. We are members of our communities. We are children and parents and aunties and uncles and friends and all of those things. And those are hard roles, even in the best of times. And we find ourselves now in a place that is not really the best of times with the COVID-19 pandemic. And then overshadowing all of that, the work that we do on climate change. And it is no exaggeration to call that a crisis. We are in a crisis, and it's a global crisis, but it's a crisis that also has very specific and unique impacts in Indian country. So what I want to do today is spend some time talking about some strategies, some tools, some ideas for how you can take what I've learned and apply it to your own communities and your own work to try to mitigate some of those impacts on our emotional health and well-being while we work against the climate crisis. All right, so I'm trying to advance, and for some reason, there we go. Okay. So briefly, I wanted to talk just a little bit about the genesis of this project, the Tribal Climate Health Project. I have been fortunate to work with collaborators and have funding from a variety of federal agencies, EPA, Bureau of Indian Affairs, National Indian Health Board. And it was primarily National Indian Health Board funding that allowed us to start developing this climate-specific crisis training for psychosocial resilience. So, we've had a mix of funding and a mix of partners to be able to make this happen, but our goals were to develop a program of collaborative climate adaptation for tribal community well-being. And that well-being includes not just the effects of climate change on the environment, but also the effects of climate change on the people who live and work and play in those environments. And that includes both physical health, and it includes social, cultural, and emotional and spiritual health. So we developed these programs, and in order to make them available to everybody, we have this program of intertribal sharing. And that's where we have this website and resource clearinghouse that I'll talk about a little bit later, and different trainings and tools that tribal communities can use to help develop their own vulnerability assessments and adaptation plans, and making sure to include the health component within those plans. So I suspect that everybody on this call or on this webinar already knows a lot about the effects of climate change on human health, but I just wanted to do a little bit of a brief overview. We have here some results from the USG CRP, which is, I can never remember the acronym, so hang on while I look at my notes. The U.S. Global Change Research Program, Climate and Human Health Assessment from 2016, which developed some key findings that, they're really kind of intuitive, but the research has borne them out, that obviously an increased exposure to climate impacts and events is going to affect health. There's no denying that, but the research shows that. And as a corollary to that, these severe impacts, especially severe weather disruptions, flooding and coastal erosion, that kind of thing, it disrupts the infrastructure that allows people and communities to get help for their healthcare and for emergency response. So given that, we are basically in a position of having to constantly be preparing for the worst case scenario of being cut off from resources and having to manage on our own some of the results of dealing with these severe impacts, whether it's severe storms or whether it's a longer term ongoing crisis like a drought. So you can see here in the graphic that there are a lot of related events and then impacts and consequences from climate change, all linked to that center wheel of rising temperatures, extreme weather, rising sea levels, which is also related, of course, to coastal erosion and melting ice in our northern regions, and increased levels of CO2. And we should also include methane with that. So moving outward, you see what all of the different potential health impacts are. And the one we're going to talk about today is things like severe mental health impacts, and then also some of the social and cultural impacts on tribal communities. So what does climate change mean for tribes and for Indigenous people? So again, things that the folks on this webinar already know, but bear pointing out again, are the fact that each tribal community is unique. And even within distinct tribal communities, there are communities within communities. For example, Diné, the Navajo Nation, there are many different chapters, and there are different geographic considerations, and there are different infrastructure and health access considerations in an area as large as Navajo. Or in the case of this photograph, this is from the Pine Ridge Reservation after they experienced some severe flooding from a severe storm. That is a large area, and their access is also going to be different within different spaces and places on that reservation. But that's also true for smaller communities. Like in Southern California, we have a lot of tribal communities in San Diego County, 18 nations, which is more than any other county in the United States, but we're also small. That doesn't mean that we can't all be thought of or considered as unique, different communities with different needs, even if we're right next door to one another. And based on those unique elements of each tribal community, you're going to see different impacts from climate change. So regardless of where you are, whether you're on a huge reservation or on a small, close to a city reservation like Paula, you're going to see disproportionate health outcomes. We're seeing that with the pandemic. We know what's going on in the Navajo Nation, and sadly here in Paula, we've had quite an outbreak of positive COVID cases over the last couple of weeks. That's not specifically climate change related, but the same sorts of impacts can be seen from climate change. And all this whole list, I won't read it, but we know that there's going to be water and food issues. There's going to be cultural community sovereignty issues. It affects people's livelihoods. Again, access to health services, whether that's because of geographic or infrastructure constraints or because of financial constraints. And then we're trying to deal with all these different laws, the treaty rights, whether or not we are truly being consulted with, what kind of consent are tribal communities being allowed to give or being asked to give, or even being made aware of for the kinds of work that's going on. So it's a very, very complicated mix of considerations. But we want to talk about psychosocial well-being specifically in today's webinar. So again, these are some things that might seem kind of like no-brainers, the kinds of stuff that will affect our psychosocial well-being. And by psychosocial well-being, I mean both the impacts of climate stress on a community's health, whether that's on culture and traditions, and also on the social and emotional wellness of individuals within that community. Those things come together as part of your overall picture of psychosocial well-being. So it's both at the community level and at the individual level. So we all know that stress affects our physical and our emotional health, but it can also affect our spiritual health. And that can be spiritual health in the respect of our religious beliefs, or in terms of our ability to actually practice our spiritual beliefs. So for example, if climate change is having an effect on a plant species that's part of ceremony, and you can no longer gather that plant, or it's becoming harder and harder to find, that has an impact on your spiritual health. Our ability to cope is definitely affected by climate change. There's a lot of feelings of hopelessness and helplessness at what seems like such an enormous problem. What is such an enormous problem? It can feel like an individual or a small community can't do much to change things. And that all relates to community well-being. If the individuals in your community are not doing well, then the overall community isn't doing well. And this illustration here, this is after the 2007 Pumacha fire, and this was on the La Jolla Reservation, where many people there were directly affected by the stress of that devastating wildfire, where people lost their homes. And that is linked to climate change, because we know that climate change is going to increase the incidence and the severity of wildfire. So how do we cope with these issues and these stresses? how do we, not only for ourselves, but for our communities, develop strategies for putting ourselves in a better position to overcome the stress and being able to move forward in the face of these crises and this trauma? So from a large scale, we're looking at coping strategies, and coping strategies include problem-solving strategies, and they also have to include caring for your community. And then at the very bottom of that, and it's at the bottom not because it's the least important, but actually because it's the biggest category, as you can see in the pyramid, is our self-care. So if you look here at the World Health Organization, this is their pyramid for the optimal mix of services for mental health. This is where the rubber meets the road, is at the bottom with self-care. And the better prepared we are to care for ourselves, then the better prepared we are to help the community care for itself. And so looking at the way the graphic is pointing here with its arrows towards high and low, we have a high frequency of the need for self-care, high frequency of the need for informal community care. But there's also a low cost associated with self-care and informal community care. What we find is that the more energy and attention we put into taking care of ourselves and taking care of our communities, the less we end up needing some of these higher cost levels of care, including all the way to the top, people needing long-term care in facilities or need to work with specialists in mental health. So if we can take care of that broad base at the bottom of the pyramid, which is ourselves, then we have a better chance of protecting our overall community from needing some of these more intensive mental health and emotional health services. But what about tribal communities? Tribal community care. Where does resilience come from? And resilience is a word that has been very closely associated with the experience of tribal communities and tribal folks. In fact, I would say it's almost a cliche now to talk about the resilience of tribes, that tribes, and it's a cliche for a reason. It's a cliche because tribes have coped over generations, over centuries with trauma. The trauma of colonialism, the trauma of being moved from homelands, the trauma of being forced to stop speaking your language and practicing your ceremony, and the trauma of having your children removed and taken away to boarding schools. So survival in the face of all that trauma, that is the true definition of resilience. And that is the basis, I think, of where tribal community care comes from, is expanding upon and enhancing and strengthening that resilience in the face of this new trauma that we are experiencing with climate change. So the resilience, it comes from all of these interconnected things. I put them as a list, but I really could have put them almost as a circle, as a cycle of culture is part of tradition, which is part of protecting and healing and sharing, again, as individuals, but also as a community. And like I said before, tribes are unique. So the cultures and the traditions, how you protect, heal, and share will all be unique within your own tribal community. And so that's where I have this group chat question for you. And I'm not going to stop and wait for you to put things in the chat box, but I would like you to share so that I can read out a little bit later. How has your community shown resilience in the face of climate change? Because we're all already facing this, so we should all already know what things we've already done that have been helpful. Or even if you want to say, this is where we've some resilience, but we'd like to improve on our resilience. So if you would, please, you can put those in the chat and I'll take a look and we'll read them out as I start to see things appear in the chat box. And if you've ever been on a webinar with me before, you will know that I have a little tool that I use to get people's attention when I want you to participate, and it's the screaming goat. So I'm going to show you my screaming goat, if you can see. I don't know if you're still looking at my face along with the slides, but the screaming goat, when I push down, so there you go. That's your alert to put something in the chat box and participate a little bit so that I can read out your answers a little bit later on. So Oh, and I have one already. Thank you, from Melody Lopez. She says, in Tucson, our urban Indians and tribal medicine and plant people have been sharing plants to be distributed to those in need. Oh, that's wonderful. That warms my heart to hear. Because the medicines, the plants, those are the things we need to protect and where some of our community values come from. Oh, my dear friend, my sister Nikki from Arizona, my community has shown resilience by forming tighter circles in order to provide food, water, and other supplies to support those in needs. And this includes providing for our traditional medicine people. Yes. And even if you're not a member of a tribal community like I'm not, you can still share the things that you've done within your family to help increase resilience. Oh, Anne Marie Chile, another sister, she says the Navajo Nation had multiple residence measures. 1, lockdown; 2, curfew; 3, food, water, supplies, deliveries; 4, medical upgrades; and 5, water access resilience. And Sarah Bliss says, started evaluating impacts to known cultural resources. Yes, as a TIPO, that's extremely important to me. Climate change does have an effect on cultural resources. And when those are damaged or destroyed, that has a tremendous impact on community emotional health. All right, I could stay here all day, but I better move on. All right. So, how do you protect well-being in your community? There are elements for well-being, and this comes from a program that was developed by Patricia Watson and some of her colleagues at the National Center for PTSD. And so I'm just going to go through these relatively quickly, but these are going to be 5 different elements for well-being that if you strengthen them and you work them into your climate adaptation plans, there are things that can help people feel more equipped to be able to deal with stress, regular stress and trauma. And because I am a lover of cats and dogs, we're going to illustrate this with very happy looking animals being comforted by their friends and in this case, their moms, who is definitely making her 2 babies here feel very, very safe. So promote a sense of safety. Give people a sense that they are safe, that they have a place to go, that they are going to have their needs looked out for. That is what promoting a sense of safety means. Knowing that there are plans in place, that there are people to turn to, that there are resources available, help people cope with some of the impacts of climate change. You also want to promote calming, and I don't know about you, but I say nothing says calming more than a pug hugging his little sheep friend, which I just think is the cutest thing I've ever seen. And I have to say, when I was looking for graphics for this presentation, I really did go down a rabbit hole of adorable puppy and kitten photos, but there are worse ways to spend an afternoon. And you want to talk about promoting calming? If you have pets, petting your dog or petting your cat will actually lower your heart rate and help with your stress response. So I do recommend it. And the thing is, there is some anxiety that's normal and healthy. Anxiety is part of our fight or flight response. And so when we're faced with an immediate danger, anxiety is what gives us that boost of energy to be able to get ourselves out of an unsafe situation. But when we are feeling the fight or flight response all the time, your heart is always beating fast, and maybe you're sweating or you're breathing heavy, you're not sleeping well, you're not taking good care of yourself, you're not hydrating or eating healthy food, it all causes long-term stress effects, bad decision making, long-term health problems. So finding ways to promote calming, and we'll talk about some of those possibilities a little later, that's another thing to help with well-being. Promote social connection. Now, it's a little bit hard to talk about this one during the pandemic because we are not being allowed to connect socially with people outside our own households. And if you're like me and you live alone, except for cats and chickens, it's not quite the same as connecting with human beings. But social connection is incredibly important. And so even if you're stuck at home and you don't have people around you, or you're tired of being around the people who are there, you can get online with somebody, you can make a phone call, you can send texts. There are still ways for us to connect socially. But social connection is not just about one-on-one relationships. Social connection is also about connection to the broader community. So social connection should also emphasize bringing people together in group spaces and group experiences so that we all feel like part of a community together, and that can help to reduce our stress. Promote a sense of self and collective efficacy. So, I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to find an animal picture to illustrate self and collective efficacy, but I feel like these two doggos really hit the nail on the head. Look at this wonderful cooperation. They're both carrying a giant stick that might be too big for either one of them alone. So this is some collective efficacy. And it's also self-efficacy because it's important to be able to ask for help. So the golden doggo said to the brown doggo, buddy, I need you to help me carry this stick. Help me with my own self-efficacy, and then collectively we're doing something to help our community, because now we're going to carry this stick to all the other dogs, and then we're all going to have a stick, which I wish our lives were so simple that we could solve problems with just carrying a stick. So I'm jealous of the dogs. But if we work together, then it not only improves our own stress response, but it also helps with community stress. And when we're dealing with trauma and adversity, you definitely want to have a collective response. And then finally, promoting a sense of hope. So, this kitty here is just hoping that the kibble is going to keep on coming, licking her chops there. If we're working towards something without a sense of hope, then we have to ask ourselves, what are we working for? And my friend Anne Marie and also my friend Amber Paris, Climate Science Alliance, they both focus a lot on climate hope. We have to hope that the work we're doing is going to make a difference. So we need to promote that in our communities too, so that people don't end up feeling helpless and hopeless. If you have no sense of hope, then you have a much harder time dealing with your own stress and trauma. So optimism and faith will go a long way towards promoting that sense of hope. Now for the strategies for tribal community care. So the example I have here of psychosocial resilience, this is what we developed specifically for Paula. So we took those 5 elements of calming, hope, safety, connectedness, and self-efficacy and put them together into this wheel with psychosocial resilience at the center. And then we have these elements on the outside that will help us to improve or operationalize all 5 of those different elements. So we're providing education on psychosocial resilience. We're working on ways to build connections in the community, making sure that we have access and the ability to deliver the first aid resources for health and psychological resources for stress, and then improving communication so that everybody in the community knows what's going on. And for example, one of the connections and strategies that we see commonly in Paula is the burning of sage. So sage burning as part of a blessing, as the beginning of a ceremony, is something that allows people to take a moment, to take a breath, to be together in that sense of connection and have a moment of calm as we deal with these difficult problems. So I'm going to share at the end some resources, and I'm going to include Paula's entire psychosocial resilience strategy for others to look at and potentially learn from and use to develop your own strategies for your own community. So these are looking at the different elements that we included in our plan. We have education. So there are a lot of different things you can educate your community on. And one of the easiest is just how to prepare for climate impacts. And if people aren't necessarily wanting to look at it from a climate change point of view, you can still talk about the impacts without saying this is going to get worse because of climate change. So you can provide education on here's how to make your home safer from wildfire. Here's a way to reduce the impacts from flooding. Here are some of the potential physical health risks, like maybe mosquitoes with disease-carrying pathogens, things like that. Just let people know what the climate impacts are going to be. Awareness can then lead to helping people plan for those incidents, plan for emergencies. Right now we're trying to push out emergency response plans on a family level in Paula so that every family is ready in case there is an emergency like a flood or a wildfire. They know what to do when that emergency happens. Teach people to recognize those symptoms. You know, not everybody knows the symptoms of stress. Not everybody is necessarily going to connect that feeling of wanting to eat every single donut in the box. I'm not saying I have personal experience with that, but I do. That's a symptom of stress. Overeating, undereating, you know, wanting to eat all the snacks, you know, or just wanting to sit on the couch and watch TV and not do anything else. That's a symptom of stress. But not everybody is going to recognize it as a symptom of stress. So that's something else you need to educate people on, is how to recognize, not just in yourself, but in the people around you, whether they are dealing with some emotional trauma. And then finally, to teach people how to cope with those stresses. And I know I'm not giving any really specific information here, but that's partly because we don't have time. And also because every community is going to be different. You're going to have different coping strategies for how to deal with specific issues. And it might not be a one-size-fits-all solution. So these are what you should do, but you're going to need to find the way that is most appropriate for your particular community. All right, so here's another one where you have an opportunity to put something into the group chat. So this is a system called How's Your Five? It was developed by Dr. Douglas Walker. He's a psychologist at the Mercy Family Center in New Orleans. And we have used this in a couple of our Tribal Climate Health Project webinars and our trainings. But I find that it's a very adaptable and very useful way to create connection. And this is just one example. There are a lot of ways for people to create connection. And you may already have in your community some excellent strategies for creating connection. But this is a good one to start with if you don't have something already in place. And that's when you have a group of people together, even if they're together for something else. So for example, we had a lot of our ladies here in Paula get together and do socially distanced mask sewing circles, where they all had their own table and their own sewing machine, all in the room, making masks for people in the community. If it's an event like that, you know, you're doing something community-based, you can start it with this. You know how it is, you know, every conversation we have, it's, you know, how are you? And people say, oh, I'm fine. And are you really? I know that that's the answer that people expect, and you don't always have to give your whole life story. My father is an example. If you ask my dad, Terry Gahn, you say, how's it going, Terry? And he'll say, well, if you got a minute, it all started in 1941 when Paul and Agnes Gahn had their third child. And like, okay, Dad, nobody wants to hear your entire life story. But just saying I'm fine doesn't always get to the truth. So if you have time in one of these community events, you can talk about how's your five, and everybody can pick just one of these five, or you can talk about all five if you want to. In fact, you could make that just the event itself. Let's all touch base with one another and see how we're feeling. But you know, you can get into pairs and you can say, all right, let's each talk about how we're doing on our work life, our love life. Are you getting any play? Are you sleeping? Are you sleeping too much? Are you sleeping not enough? How are your eating habits? This is going beyond I'm fine. And if you've been paying attention, you can see that this is our second opportunity for the group to chime in. Pick one of the five and share with us, how is it going for you? And I'm always fascinated to see how things cluster up. If you're only picking one, how many people are going to pick, you know, the same one, basically, which one is going to be the most popular? I'll start, and I always pick eat, because you guys, I mentioned donuts, and actually I'm going back to the chat here, and Alex Warnicki says, I didn't know this was going to be about not eating donuts. Alex, girl, I'm right there with you. For me, it is not about not eating donuts. It's about eating too many donuts. So, and I always use donuts as the example, but what a coincidence. Somebody brought donuts into the office today, and I have now had 2 donuts. So is 2 donuts too many donuts? I don't think so. But in the big scheme of things, if all you're eating is donuts and chips and junk food, then you're not fine. There's more that you could be doing to be paying attention to what's triggering you to not be respectful of your body by giving it nourishing food. I mean, okay, you know, I'm respecting my tongue when I eat donuts, but I'm not really respecting my belly. And so think about that. Is it too much? Is it too little? You know, sleep. For me, I sleep too much. I could sleep all the time. I'm a champion Olympic gold medal sleeper. But for other people, they toss and turn. They have insomnia. Nikki has a response here. She says, I feel like I'm sleeping better even in these stressful times. I wake up at 5 or 5:30 each day, offer my prayers, let the chickens out of the coop, and start my day. By the bedtime, I'm too exhausted to have insomnia or stay up worrying. I like that. Now that I have chickens, I'm going to have to start getting up at 5 or 5:30 to let the ladies out of the coop. And you know what? The prayer doesn't hurt anything either. Cynthia says, sleep. I could always use more sleep. I'm tired. I think we're all tired. I can definitely relate to that. Emily Corin, she says, and makes a good point, this one gets into cultural aspects. Asian communities in my region are reluctant to state challenges and will only share the happy things. Thank you so much for pointing that out, Emily, because you're right. When you're talking about individual cultural values and practices, something like this might not always work if you've been encultured from birth to only be positive. It would be really hard to get people to talk about the difficulties that they're having. Courtney says, work. Sometimes I feel that I am working all the time, not enough separation during home officing, or not enough by not feeling productive. And now I'm going to ask Tamara to expand on hers. She says, blessedly, 3 is awesome sauce right now. Now 3 is play. And people don't usually pick play. It's usually eat or sleep or work. So Tamara, if you want to share why play is so wonderful for you right now, then please go for it. And Emily also says, I'd love a systemization of feelings, scale, resource availability, because I'm polling my community, identifying resource gaps, and connecting community members to resources when they're available. Yeah, we'll be saving the chat here so we can do follow-up when we're done. Oh, I love it. There's so many messages. I'm going to try to get through these real quickly because I don't want to miss anyone. Allison Meadows says, sleep. I keep waking up at 3 a.m. I'm an early riser usually, but that is just too early. No kidding. And Anna Lutz Johnson says, I've felt more peace in my sleep routine, but find myself waking up after sleeping 3 or 4 hours some nights. You guys, actually last night in my dreams, Donald Trump was in my dream last night. So, sorry to be political, but that's not a dream. That's a nightmare. I'm just saying. When I'm asleep, I want to escape. I don't want things to be worse when I'm asleep. My friend Andrea Candelaria says, work. I work too much and use it as a way of keeping the wheels spinning and not thinking of other things. Also has the added effect of stressing out my family. Yeah. Yvette Wiley says, work, the daily grind on Monday through Friday, a 140-mile daily commute. Holy cow. Yeah, she says, ready for freedom and retirement. No kidding. Oh, we have a play. Ronald Willis says, I bought a boat to give my family a way to stay cool, enjoy outside, and social distance this summer. Ronald, please tell us where you live. We will all be there with our masks this weekend. Melody says, sadly, less play with loved ones, but lots of work, sleep, and eat. And Tamara says that she and her kids and her dogs are in the Teton Valley in Idaho right now, which is her second home. So she's doing a mama's summer camp. So that's wonderful. And then finally, we have a love. Thank you, Richard Moss, for bringing up love. Says, family is my source of strength at the moment. I have a new grandson, my first, who lives 2 miles away. Requires strict quarantine, but what joy to hold him. Oh, it actually makes me tear up. Congratulations. I think any child that is born today is a child of hope. So congratulations to you. I think that's wonderful. All right. Thank you, you guys. I think this sharing is one of the most important things we can do. But I do have a few more slides, so I'm going to go ahead and move forward. All right, so we're moving on to the response portion of our strategies. And so one thing you need to look at is psychological first aid, or PFA. This is from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. So again, psychological first aid. So what are we looking for? And it's similar to our wellness strategies from before, or the elements of well-being. So we need our basic needs taken care of, but we also have to listen and comfort, connect, protect, instill hope. So again, these are some of the same things as our well-being strategies, but with psychological first aid, this is when we are dealing with somebody who is in immediate need. And so we need to offer them that safe place to be able to unburden themselves and get things off their chest. And if the culture and the values in your community or the community where you work is that it's not acceptable to unburden yourself in that way, then I would hope that there is some way you can modify this to use those community values and traditions and cultural practices to be able to customize this to what is going to work best, or to find within each one of these elements, what does listening mean in this community? What does protection mean in this community? It's not going to be the same in every single place. And again, at the end, I'm going to show you some resources where you can find a little bit more about each one of the things we've covered, so that you can hopefully learn more and find ways to tailor these things to your own specific communities and your own specific needs. And then the final element in Paula's plan is communication. So, this one is fairly basic, and it circles back to the education component. But if you're going to communicate things, you need to communicate the right things. So providing information, again, this is pretty much a no-brainer, but how are you going to provide that information? It's not always easy to get the information that's necessary out to maybe some of the more remote portions of your reservation. In Paula, we have taken advantage of a lot of social media. We have a lot of followers on our Planet Paula Instagram, our Paula Environmental Department webpage, and we are developing some new systems that relate to 2 and 3 on this list, the early warning systems and emergency notifications. You may be aware already of the IPAWS system, which is a FEMA system. It's the Public Alert Warning System. That's where the pause comes from. And you can become a part of that system, and basically it's kind of like an Amber Alert thing, where anybody within a particular area will get a warning. Let's say if there's a tornado approaching or there's some emergency that the community needs to be aware of. Now in Paula, we decided not to do the pause system because it's going to overlap with some of the FEMA alert systems that are already present in San Diego County, because it's such a big, high population county. We do overlap with their emergency system. So instead, we are doing an emergency notification system based on opt-in texting. I think you've all seen those things where it says, send subscribe to this number, and then you end up subscribing to a system. So we're going to do that for Paula, and that way we can alert people if there's a wildfire, if there is poor air quality and people need to stay indoors, if there is an outbreak of infectious disease. For example, we have squirrels nearby that get tested and sometimes end up positive for being carriers of plague, which, just don't panic. Plague is easily treated with antibiotics now, but it wasn't in the dark ages. In any case, we're going to use that to alert people. Now, again, it is opt-in, but especially with our young folks, they're all over cell phones and texting. So what we're going to do is have the people that opt in include in those notifications, please alert friends and family who may not receive this message. So in other words, check on your grandmothers, check on your aunties, check on the people who might not get the text alert, but who need to know what's going on. So we're bringing in the community, that whole self-efficacy and group efficacy, by getting the community involved. You can do the same thing with your status updates, whatever your system may be. Another thing that we're thinking about is getting a billboard, kind of a digital billboard for the front of our tribal administration building, the kind of thing where you can customize it to have messages like, general council meeting this week, or Paula Temecula Road closed because of flooding, that kind of thing. You can put those on your message board because people pass by the administration building all the time. But number 5 here is important. Just make sure you have multiple channels so that you can reach the most people with the most possible channels with the information that you need to communicate, whether that's emergency communication or whether that's educational communication like we talked about previously. Okay, so this is the last but not least on our little slideshow here. Don't forget about yourself. Now, I couldn't find a picture of a kitten hugging itself. So I think kittens hugging each other is as good as it's going to get. But we cannot help other people if we don't take care of ourselves first. So I think it's a good idea for us all to start our days with something like what Nikki suggested. You know that you have things to do. You got to let the chickens out of the coop. You got to get the kids ready for school. You got to wake up your husband, whatever the case may be. But take that moment for yourself too. Even if you do How's Your 5 one-on-one with yourself. How did I sleep last night? Have I done anything fun lately? For me, you guys, I'm so thrilled that even though the season is short and weird, baseball is back. Just having a baseball game on the radio in the background, it does amazing things for my stress levels, just because it's something that I associate with good times and hot dogs and nachos. I mean, what's not to like? So your work, your play, your sleep, your love, your eating, check in on yourself. Say a little prayer. Take 60 seconds to just close your eyes and not think at all, which is hard to do, but with practice, you can master that meditation, even if it's only for 60 seconds. And then I think the most important thing of all, this kitten is not hugging itself. These are kittens hugging each other. Ask if you need help. Reach out to your friends. Talk to your family. Let's all talk to each other. The work that we do is incredibly difficult work. It is stressful. It is hard to not lose hope sometimes. But remember, every one of us is out there. We're going through the same things, and we are here for one another. I am here for any one of you. My email inbox is open, and if you need me, I will respond. That goes for my friends who I wish I could hug to the people I have never seen. But if we're not there for each other, then we can't be there for anybody else. So if you take away nothing else from this, take this away. You need to take care of yourself. All right, so a couple of resources. Now these are, they're actually links, and the slides are going to be shared with all of you as a PDF, so they are hyperlinks that you can visit. So the first, this is the Tribal Climate Health Project that I mentioned at the beginning. And we have a lot of resources under the resources tab, including Paula's Psychosocial Resilience Framework that goes over a lot of what I just went over. We also have educational materials on the Paula Environmental Department webpage. And then, of course, resources that I'm sure all of you have already used. National Indian Health Board, which provided the funding for this training. The Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals, ITEP, of course, is always on the list. And then the Southwest CASC, which was kind enough with Althea's help to host today's webinar. And with that, I want to say thank you very much. And I think we have about 10 minutes left for questions.
Yes, thank you, Shasta, so much. It's always fun to spend time with you and learn from you. And yeah, I've at least smiled a few times and chuckled a few times. So thank you so much for just making me smile. So please enter your questions at the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen, and we will take those there. So you do have a question already. How have you navigated maintaining community connection for individuals that don't have technology or access to internet?
Wow, that is a terrific question to which I don't have an immediate response. Everyone here in Paula does have access to the internet. We are pretty fortunate here. But I know that there are other people who are dealing with communities that don't have the same access. I think as a brainstorm, the first thing that comes to mind is that you need to actually visit people in person or take advantage of old school methods of delivery like mailers, newsletters that are actually, printed and mailed. But I would actually, if to those who are listening, if you have responses to that, please respond to Anna's question, or it might be Anna. I'm sorry, Anna, if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. Anna or Anna with one N. But yeah, how do you manage this community connection if you don't have the internet technology?
From Nikki Cooley, would you make the same recommendations for our youth in regards to the the 5 asks of yourself?
Yeah, I would. I'm not a parent, so people with kids might have a different response to this, but I do think it's important to talk about those 5 things with kids. The loved one might elicit some giggles if you're dealing with teenagers, because they might conflate love with something that's, a little bit more physical. But I do think it's important because love and work and play and eating and sleeping, those can be disrupted in our kids as well. If you see that your kid is spending all of their time, on the internet or, playing games and it seems to be having an effect on the rest of their life, then, ask them about those things. And we all know that kids are in a really interesting position right now, and I don't envy them because a lot of the climate change rhetoric is about, oh, the youth, there's all this hope in the youth are going to save us. That is a heck of a burden to put on young people, that it's all on them. So I would definitely check in frequently with your youth, and I think that those 5 areas are a great place to start.
And in response to the question about the internet connection and the digital divide, Dara Marks Marino from ITEP says, I think the no internet problem is something that has to be planned for ahead of time with designated people to make phone calls, maybe use a phone tree or do in-person outreach. Thank you, Dara. Were there any other questions, comments, feedback any of the participants would like to provide? Any last thoughts, words of wisdom, Shasta?
Well, I do want to read another one of the comments in the chat where I get a big thank you from Yvette, and I'm not going to try to pronounce it in the traditional language, but big thank you for the cat and dog pictures. I am an animal person and cat net, and this brightened my day. Seriously, same. Honestly, I was trying to find pictures of people to illustrate that, and here's one of those fun things. It's all white people. Like, I'm not, enough. I don't want to put a bunch of pictures of stock photos of, white people hugging each other. I'm over it. Like, everybody can agree on cats and dogs, right?
The Institute of the Environment, so the host of this webinar, the Southwest CASC, the link to the recording for this webinar will be at the southwestcasc.arizona.edu/webinars. Sarah, thank you for putting that in the chat box. As you hang up, you'll see that a survey will pop up, so please provide your feedback to us. We will be saving the chat and the Q&A portion of this webinar to respond to anything that we may have missed. But we greatly appreciate everybody coming. And Richard Moss says, thanks for the talk. Very uplifting. My question, do you have any thoughts on balancing resilience and sustainability and coping with COVID? In my world, things like reuse of materials are going out of the window.
Oh, why are you guys asking me questions I can't answer? Richard, I have noticed exactly the same thing, and that is really hard for me, and I think it's hard for a lot of us. My inclination is to never throw anything away that can be recycled, and yet recycling is not being accepted in some places. I mean, even once I went to St. Louis 4 or 5 years ago for NAF, National Adaptation Forum, and I went to a restaurant and had a bottle of root beer and asked where I could recycle it, and they're like, recycle it? We don't recycle. I'm like, oh my God, you guys, I took that bottle home. I packed it and took it home because I could not bear not being able to recycle it. So this is an important question, but I would say that in the COVID crisis, the immediate priority needs to be human health and human life. And if that means that we're going to have to put a little pause on some of our sustainability efforts that are related directly to some of this human health protection work, then I guess that's just the sacrifice that we're going to have to make. But I would love to give this more thought and hear from any others if you want to follow up by email, because I don't really have a good answer for that. I'm sorry.
Nikki said, yes, during my trainings, I will collect compost in a mason jar and send it home with the supplies. It doesn't stink if you put it in a glass jar with a tight lid. And I think too, in response to the balance between resilient sustainability and, addressing COVID-19 or going through this pandemic, and the balance of, even if we feel that we may be having to toss more things out, but I think looking at, especially for those who have had to travel a lot for work, we're not traveling. And even just being here at home and in town, the amount that I'm driving my car is very less, if any at all anymore. And so, I think there's a balance there that we see of, being stuck at home. There are some pros to that in respect to sustainability and our carbon footprint.
Yeah, that's a good point. We are driving less, at least. Yeah. Well, I'm still going to work every day, but I'm not going anywhere else. So
we may be eating more too, but
well, don't feel guilty about that occasional donut, Alex. I'm talking to you now.
That's self-care.
Fine. Just everybody take care of one another, take care of yourselves, and yeah, keep up the good work.
Yes, thank you all, and thank you, Shasta. Round of applause.
Thank you.
All right. Let's see. Carolyn.